These days people recognize my name for the wrong reasons. To the tabloids, I'm the cold heir who froze his own father out of his will. To the board, I'm just the majority shareholder who showed up out of nowhere and gutted the man who built the company. None of them know that I used to stand outside that same building as a kid, palms sweating, staring up at his last name in chrome letters and wondering if he ever thought about mine. Legally, it never existed. On paper, I was just my mother's son, the byproduct of an affair he denied so completely that even my birth certificate felt like a lie. I tell people I'm 32, self-made, ruthlessly practical. That part is true. What I don't tell them is that every calculated move I make, every share I buy, every vote I swing, is still orbiting one missing word he refused to sign. Father. This is the story of what happens when the unwanted kid inherits more than the old man ever imagined, and finally comes back to collect a different kind of debt. If that sounds dramatic, good. For most of my life, the only power I had was the story in my head, and I've spent years sharpening it into a weapon. I grew up in a cramped third-floor walk-up that always smelled like boiled cabbage and cheap detergent. My mother worked nights at a hotel, folding towels for guests who would never learn her name. I learned my father's name early, not because she told me, but because she slipped once and the sound of it changed her whole face. Mercer. It sat heavy on her tongue, like something you weren't supposed to say in daylight. When she told me the story, I was 9. They'd had an affair when they were both young and stupid. He was married, already successful, already building the empire whose logo I would later see everywhere. When she got pregnant, he didn't threaten or scream. He just smiled this small, bored smile and said, "Take care of it." When she refused, he wrote a check and walked away. No paternity test. No acknowledgement. The key event, the moment that got welded into my bones, happened 3 years later. I was 12, wearing my one good shirt, standing in the marble lobby of Mercer Holdings because my mother had finally broken. She brought me there like evidence, like a living subpoena, convinced that if he just saw my face, something in him would recognize itself and soften. Security stopped us before we even reached the elevators. My mother kept insisting she had an appointment. She didn't, but her voice trembled in that way that made grown men uncomfortable. They called up to his office anyway. I remember the guard's expression shifting, not to sympathy, but to something like embarrassment. He handed my mother the phone so she could hear it herself. His assistant didn't bother lowering her voice. "Mr. Mercer says he has no idea who you're talking about, and he would appreciate if you stopped showing up with stories." Stories. That word hit harder than the rejection itself. I wasn't a child, just a rumor she carried in her arms. Security escorted us out, not rough, but firm enough that people stared. By the time we reached the sidewalk, my mother was shaking so badly I thought she might collapse. That moment cleaved my life in two. Kids at school had always whispered about my missing dad. But after that day, I stopped pretending he might someday materialize. The shame followed me everywhere. Every PDA form with an empty line. Every snide joke about mystery fathers. It hardened something in me, made me wary, made me obsessed with earning what couldn't be given. Proof that I mattered. Decades slid by in a way that felt both fast and cruel. Like watching a house rot in slow motion but realizing the foundation had cracked long before you noticed. I left home at 18 with a scholarship, a duffel bag, and a promise to myself that I'd never need anything from anyone again. On the surface, I did well, degrees, promotions, investments, but every milestone tasted faintly metallic, like victory mixed with old blood. I told myself I didn't care about Mercer anymore, that his denial was ancient history, but the truth was quieter and meaner. I carried him everywhere, a ghost stitched into every ambition. I avoided my hometown for years. Even phone calls with my mother became sparse, not out of resentment, but because every conversation dragged me back to that lobby, to her trembling hands, to the guard's reluctant pity. Time didn't heal it. It just layered new responsibilities over the old wound until I could almost pretend it wasn't there. But late at night, those hours when work couldn't drown out memory, I'd still picture his signature on company documents, bold and unbothered, the same signature he refused to place beside my name. That absence shaped me more than any presence could. It became a map I followed without meaning to, leading me further from who I might have been. It was a courier envelope that finally cracked open the past. Thick, cream-colored, the kind used for legal documents that never bring good news. I almost tossed it on the counter unopened, assuming it was another investment packet or shareholder update. But then I saw the sender, Mercer and Tate, Estate Division. For a full minute I just stared at the name, feeling something old and corrosive flicker awake in my chest. Inside was a formal letter informing me of matters relevant to the late Charles Mercer. Late. The word sank slowly, like a stone through mud. I read it 3 times before the meaning settled. He was gone. The man who spent his whole life pretending I didn't exist had slipped out of the world without ever having to see my face again. But the kicker came in the second paragraph. I was required to attend a private reading of his will. Required. As if I were suddenly legitimate enough to summon. As if he'd finally spoken my name aloud, even if only in a legal directive drafted by someone else. I felt this strange, humming dread under my ribs. Not grief, just a disoriented, electric unease. Why me? Why now? What possible reason could he have to drag me into the story he'd spent a lifetime denying? The envelope seemed heavier the longer I held it, as though the past itself had been waiting for the perfect moment to claw its way back. I barely slept that night. It wasn't sorrow keeping me awake, but a kind of nauseating vertigo. Like the ground was tilting under a truth I hadn't caught up to yet. I kept pacing my apartment, touching the envelope as if it might suddenly burn me. Every old emotion I'd buried, anger, humiliation, that pathetic childhood hope, rose like smoke from a fire I thought I'd extinguished years ago. I didn't want anything from him. That was the refrain I kept repeating, but the tremor in my hands betrayed me. At one point, I caught my reflection in the kitchen window and froze. My jawline, the shape of my eyes, details I'd always chalked up to random genetics, suddenly felt borrowed, inherited. For years, I'd avoided comparing myself to him, terrified of finding even a sliver of resemblance. Now those similarities stared back at me with quiet accusation. By dawn, the shock had curdled into something heavier, a weight sinking through my lungs. I wasn't prepared for this. I wasn't prepared to be acknowledged, not posthumously, not legally, not in any form. A part of me wanted to tear the letter in half, to refuse the summons outright, but another part, some wounded, furious kid still living in my bones, wanted to walk into that office and finally hear someone say, "Yes, we know who you are." The appointment was set for a Thursday morning in a conference room overlooking the river. I arrived early, mostly because I couldn't stand pacing my apartment any longer. When the receptionist directed me to a private suite, I half expected to find a room full of Mercers. His legitimate family, polished and tight-lipped, glaring at the intruder. Instead, there was just one person already seated at the long table. A young man, maybe mid-20s, dark hair, expensive suit worn with the stiffness of someone not used to privilege but suddenly thrust into it. He looked up as I entered, and something in his expression flickered. Recognition? No, more like calculation. "Marcus Hale?" he asked, using my mother's surname. "Yeah," I said, taking a seat at the opposite end. "You?" He hesitated, then offered a small, strangely formal nod. "Evan Mercer." Mercer. Hearing it spoken so simply sent a quiet shock through me, like tapping a bruise. He didn't look like the executive heirs I'd stalked online years ago. He looked nervous, curious, almost relieved I'd shown up at all. Before I could ask anything else, the estate attorney entered, shuffling papers, clearly unaware of the tension crackling between us. As he began outlining the proceedings, Evan kept glancing my way, as though testing whether I'd asked the question neither of us had voiced yet. Something in his gaze hinted at a truth the letter hadn't explained. Something deeper, heavier, waiting to detonate. When the attorney finally reached the addendum, his tone shifted, too gentle, too rehearsed. He explained that Charles Mercer had left a supplemental directive, to be read only if both of us were present. Evan straightened, clasping his hands like he already knew what was coming. I didn't. I just felt that old pressure in my chest, the one that used to hit right before a punchline that wasn't funny. The attorney unfolded a separate page and read aloud, To my sons, Marcus Hale and Evan Mercer. I didn't hear the rest at first. The word sons rang in my ears like someone had struck a tuning fork against my skull. For a second I honestly thought I'd misheard. But Evan wasn't looking at the attorney. He was looking directly at me, his expression soft but unbearably steady, as if he'd been waiting years for someone to confirm what he already believed. The document went on to explain that our father, my father apparently, had acknowledged us privately in his final months, confessing that he'd failed both of us in different ways. Evan was his recognized heir, raised inside the machine. I was the unrecognized one, kept at a distance by cowardice and convenience. My stomach dropped. Every memory of that lobby, that denial, that word stories, all of it twisted into something newly devastating. He had known. He had always known. Vous skazali. Next. ChatGPT skazal. Part 9. 1,250 to 1,350 characters. The attorney's voice eventually dissolved into a low hum behind my heartbeat. I tried to focus on the legal jargon. Inheritance percentages, property transfers, corporate voting rights, but the room felt slanted, like gravity had shifted under my chair. Knowing he'd lied was one thing. Knowing he'd admitted the truth only when he was safely beyond consequence was another. Punched through every defense I'd spent years building. Evan cleared his throat once the attorney stepped out to give us a moment, though it sounded more like a mercy exit. I kept staring at the polished table, watching my own distorted reflection tremble in the grain. I'd imagined facing my father 1,000 different ways. Angry, triumphant, indifferent, but I'd never imagined facing his other son. Worse, I hadn't expected the strange ache tightening inside me. Not anger, not relief, but something rawer. A sense of being rewritten without consent. My entire life had been shaped around the void he left, and now that void had edges, borders, explanations I wasn't sure I wanted. The impact rippled outward instantly. If this was true, then every decision I'd made, every ambition sharpened by rejection, was suddenly anchored to a lie by omission. My identity, once so fiercely independent, felt provisional again, like someone had reached back into my childhood and pulled a thread that held everything together. The anger didn't come all at once. It built slowly, like heat rising under a closed door. Evan tried to speak, some tentative Marcus. I know this is a lot, but the words scraped against something raw in me. A lot. I laughed, sharp enough to make him flinch. Your father pretended I didn't exist for 32 years. Now I'm supposed to, what? Be grateful he scribbled my name into a lawyer's letter right before dying? Evan didn't fire back. He just folded his hands, shoulders tense but not defensive. That restraint only fueled the storm brewing in my chest. You knew, I accused, or at least suspected. That's why you kept looking at me like you were checking for a resemblance. He didn't deny it, and the silence between us cracked open. Memories surged, the lobby, the humiliation, the decade of believing I was some inconvenient fiction. Fury blurred my vision. I stood up so fast the chair groaned. He could have fixed this while he was alive, I said. He could have said one damn sentence. Evan's voice was quiet when he finally replied. And if he had, would you have wanted anything to do with him? The question hit harder than any accusation. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. That silence, my silence, felt like its own kind of collapse. Evan didn't rush to fill the silence I left hanging. He just exhaled slowly, like he'd practiced this moment in his head and still wasn't sure he deserved to speak it aloud. Look, he said, eyes fixed on the table instead of me. I'm not here to defend him. I spent my whole life thinking he was a good man. A demanding one, sure, but fair. Then 2 years ago he got sick and things shifted. I stayed standing, arms crossed, but something in his tone made the anger lose its sharpest edge. He called me into his study one night, Evan continued. He was thinner, exhausted, not pretending anymore. He told me there was someone he'd wronged, someone who should have been part of our family. He didn't say your name, but he said you were the consequence of his worst cowardice. His words, not mine. He finally met my eyes, and there was no pity there, just honesty edged with regret. I tried to push him, he said. I told him he needed to contact you himself. He said he would, but every week he delayed. I think he was terrified. Not of you, of what admitting you meant about him. The room felt smaller suddenly, the air heavier. Hearing his perspective didn't absolve anything, but it added weight, complication, to a story I'd spent years flattening into something easier to hate. I sat back down because my legs were starting to shake, and the last thing I wanted was for Evan to notice. He continued quietly, but there was this tremor in his voice now, something unpolished that didn't match his tailored suit. The night he died, he said. He asked for the addendum to be finalized. He made me read it. Not the whole will, just the part about you. I think he needed to hear it spoken aloud. Needed someone to witness it. For some reason, that undid me more than anything else. Not the money, not the acknowledgement, not even the word sons, but the idea of him lying in some dimly lit room, body failing, choosing the safest possible moment to speak my existence into reality. I felt something crack open in my chest, a pressure I'd carried since childhood, suddenly expanding until my breath stuttered. He waited until he couldn't face me, I whispered. He waited until there was no risk. Evan blinked hard, jaw tightening. Maybe, or maybe he just didn't know how to ask for forgiveness from someone he'd never given a chance to hate him properly. The absurdity of it, a man too powerful to say a single honest sentence, hit me like a tidal wave. And for the first time since walking into that room, the truth didn't enrage me. It hollowed me out. I felt tears gather, hot and humiliating, and didn't bother hiding them. I wiped my face with the heel of my hand, more frustrated than comforted by the gesture. Crying in front of a stranger, my brother apparently, felt like another loss I hadn't prepared for. But once the dam cracked, the truth rushed out in ways I couldn't contain. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with any of this, I said. My voice sounded older than I felt, like it carried decades that didn't belong to me. He denied me, pretended I wasn't real, made my mother feel crazy. Now he wants what, closure? Some neat bow tied around the mess he left behind? Evan didn't push back. He just nodded, slow and deliberate. You don't owe him absolution, but you do deserve the space to decide what comes next without him deciding it for you. I let that sink in. For years, everything I'd done, every ruthless step up the corporate ladder, every calculated investment, had been driven by a ghost, a refusal, a missing name. Now that ghost had finally spoken, and the blueprint of my entire life suddenly felt optional. I'm not sure I want anything from his estate, I admitted. Not the money, not the shares, none of it. Evan tilted his head. Then don't take it for him. Take it for yourself. Or walk away. But whatever you choose, let it be yours. For the first time since opening that envelope, I felt something steady beneath my feet. Choice, real and unnarrated by anyone else. In the days that followed, everything moved with this surreal underwater slowness. Emails from the estate, calls from board members who suddenly spoke to me with forced warmth, journalists sniffing around. Each one felt like someone else trying to define what this moment should mean for me. But underneath the noise, something quieter was shifting. For the first time, my choices weren't reactions to a man who refused to see me. They were mine alone. I met with the estate attorney again, this time without Evan. I expected to feel overwhelmed by the numbers, the assets, the sheer scale of what I was suddenly entitled to. Instead, what hit me hardest was how meticulously my father had arranged everything at the end. As if he'd spent his final months trying to rebuild a bridge he'd never dared to cross in life. It didn't excuse anything, but it complicated everything. I didn't accept the full inheritance. I diverted a portion into a fund under my mother's name, a quiet correction of a wrong he'd let her shoulder alone. Another part one earmarked for charity, not out of virtue, but because I refused to let all that money become proof of a bond he'd never actually earned. The rest, I kept. Not for him, but because walking away entirely felt like letting him dictate the ending too. Now, months later, I keep circling back to one quiet truth. Some debts don't vanish when the debtor dies. They shift shape, They become choices instead of chains. For most of my life, I thought revenge meant forcing him to see me, to acknowledge what he'd thrown away. But in the end, the real reckoning wasn't with him. It was with the version of myself built around his absence. I still drive past the Mercer building sometimes. The chrome letters don't sting the way they used to. They're just letters now, not a verdict. Evan and I talk occasionally. Awkward lunches, cautious updates. Both of us learning how to exist without the man who connected us only by omission. There's no tidy sibling bond. No instant forgiveness. Just two people sorting through the fallout of someone else's choices. And honestly, that feels real. If there's a lesson buried in all this, it's that time doesn't heal everything, but it does offer angles we couldn't see before. I spent years chasing a ghost, and when he finally named me, I realized I didn't need his acknowledgement to exist. I never did. What mattered was claiming my own story, even the parts he tried to erase.